What would you do if your HOA decided that your mailbox was an inch too tall and fined you $200 for it? Or if they rewrote the rulebook just to make your house non-compliant overnight? I never thought I'd become the neighborhood rebel, but sometimes, life forces your hand. My name is Ethan, and after 15 years as a structural engineer, I thought I understood rules. I built homes, designed communities, and worked within city codes stricter than an overcooked steak. But nothing prepared me for the dictatorship that was Sunnyside Estates, or for the iron grip of Karen Wilkins, HOA president, self-appointed queen of uniformity, and an unstoppable force of suburban tyranny. When I first toured the neighborhood, it looked like a dream. Every lawn was trimmed to perfection, every house painted in shades of beige so similar they could have been copied and pasted. The previous owner mentioned that the HOA was a little particular, but that didn't bother me. I could follow rules. In fact, I was good at it. Then Karen arrived at my doorstep 3 days after I moved in, standing so stiffly in her pristine white suit that I wondered if she had ever sat down in her life. The crisp bob of blonde hair didn't shift an inch as she inspected me, her eyes scanning my home like a drill sergeant evaluating a cadet. "Welcome to Sunnyside Estates," she said, shoving a thick binder into my hands, the gold-embossed words "Community Guidelines" catching the afternoon sun. All 78 pages are mandatory reading. I recommend highlighting sections on lawn maintenance and exterior modifications. We've had issues with new homeowners in the past. The way she said issues made it sound like past residents had installed a roller coaster in their backyard or painted their house neon pink. I nodded politely, assuming this would be the last I saw of her. How naive I was. That evening, while unpacking, I flipped through the handbook, expecting basic rules about trash collection and parking. Instead, I found a legal labyrinth so complex it could have been written by corporate lawyers on caffeine overdoses. There were 12 approved shades of beige for exterior paint, each with a color code. Mailboxes had strict size and placement requirements. Even garden gnomes had a height limit, 8 inches, in case you were wondering. Still, I was determined to play by the book. My lawn was cut to exactly 3.5 inches, my trash bins were visible only during the allowed 12-hour collection window, and my mailbox matched the precise shade of HOA-approved matte black. For 6 months, I lived under the radar, watching from my window as Karen patrolled the neighborhood in her luxury SUV, clipboard in hand, issuing fines for wind chimes that were too loud or seasonal wreaths left up a day past the grace period. I thought I had won. I thought I had mastered the HOA's impossible standards. Then I planted a row of perfectly legal hedges, and unknowingly started a war. The hedges were supposed to be a simple upgrade, a practical solution to an annoying problem. My property sat on a corner lot facing a busy street, and while I didn't mind the occasional traffic, I preferred a bit of privacy. The HOA handbook was clear: natural privacy barriers were allowed as long as they didn't exceed 6 feet in height or obstruct street visibility. Being the meticulous person that I am, I double-checked every specification before making my decision. After a week of research, I settled on emerald green arborvitaes, an HOA-approved species, and hired a landscaper from the HOA's own approved list to install them. We planted them exactly 5 feet 10 inches tall, well under the maximum limit. They were placed 15 feet from the curb, 5 feet more than required for safety clearance. I even documented the entire process, taking pictures and measurements just in case. For 3 blissful weeks, I enjoyed the peace they provided. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, I pulled into my driveway and saw something that made my blood boil. Karen was standing on my lawn, arms folded, watching 2 landscapers butcher my hedges with electric trimmers. What had been a lush, green privacy screen that perfectly met HOA standards was now a row of stumpy, pathetic shrubs, barely 3 feet tall. I slammed my car door shut and strode toward them, heart pounding. What the hell is going on? I demanded, voice tight with barely controlled fury. Karen turned, her perfect plastic smile already in place. "Oh, Ethan, I was just about to email you. Your hedges were in violation of Code 4.7b, they obstructed a critical sightline at the corner. As president, I have the authority to remedy violations when homeowners fail to comply. Fail to comply? I nearly laughed at the absurdity of the accusation. I never even got a violation notice. She waved a manicured hand dismissively. It was emailed to all residents last week. The board held an emergency vote, and for safety reasons, we approved immediate action. She gestured to a small orange flag that I was certain hadn't been there this morning. This is a designated sightline protection zone. You should really read the handbook more carefully. I turned to the landscapers, who looked uncomfortable. How much is she paying you? One of them hesitated before muttering, she already did. Cash. Karen beamed, adjusting her diamond bracelet. And as a courtesy, the HOA has billed you $375 for the landscaping service. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. Every part of me wanted to shout, but I knew anger wouldn't win this fight. I had spent nearly 2 decades managing multi-million-dollar construction projects, dealing with bureaucratic nightmares and entitled clients who thought their word was law. I knew how to play the game. That night, I pored over the HOA handbook, determined to find a way to fight back. I refused to believe Karen had unilateral power to destroy my property. Then, on page 57, buried in the fine print, I found my answer. While natural privacy barriers had strict height limits, structural privacy walls had a completely different set of rules. A solid perimeter fence made of approved materials could be built up to 6 feet high, provided it met county codes and received approval from the Architectural Review Committee. There were no ridiculous plant species lists, no arbitrary sightline exemptions, just a clean-cut rule that Karen couldn't manipulate. By morning, I had a plan. I spent the next 24 hours drawing professional blueprints, carefully mapping out a 6-foot cinder block wall that perfectly complied with every regulation. I submitted the application to the Architectural Review Committee, complete with structural calculations, material specifications, and a rendering that even included HOA-approved desert flora in decorative planters. According to the bylaws, the committee had 14 days to respond. If they failed to do so, my application would be automatically approved. I was ready for a fight. But what I wasn't ready for was Karen changing the rules just to get back at me. For days after I submitted my application, I woke up to another violation notice taped to my front door. This time, the complaint wasn't about my hedges. It was about my house paint. Apparently, Sandstone Whisper, the very color that had been approved when I moved in, was now no longer on the HOA's pre-approved list. I checked the new rule update, and sure enough, Karen had pushed through an emergency amendment just days earlier, removing my specific shade from the approved colors. And guess what? The only new approved additions were a handful of shades that just so happened to match the exterior of Karen's house. I stood there, staring at the notice in my hands, feeling my anger settle into something more dangerous, determination. Karen had just declared war. She had no idea how badly she was going to lose. The morning of day 15 arrived with a crisp blue sky and a quiet tension hanging in the air. I had waited exactly 2 weeks for the Architectural Review Committee to respond to my wall application, knowing full well they wouldn't. I had called the HOA office twice to check on the status, each time being told, the committee is reviewing it. But I knew the truth. Karen hadn't even circulated my request to the other board members. Whether by incompetence or sheer arrogance, she had let the deadline pass, assuming I wouldn't dare to act without her approval. But HOA rules were HOA rules, and by the book, my project was now automatically approved. At 8 a.m. Sharp ***, I climbed into the rented mini excavator, fired up the engine, and started digging the foundation for my wall. The steady hum of the machine echoed down the street, and within an hour, I saw it, Karen's luxury SUV screeching to a stop in front of my house. She didn't even bother parking properly, just flung the driver's side door open and marched toward me, heels sinking slightly into my freshly dug dirt. Her face was flushed, her usual icy composure nowhere to be found. "What do you think you're doing? You can't build a wall here," she shrieked, waving a clipboard like it was a sword of justice. "Stop this immediately, or I'll call the police." I calmly powered down the excavator, stepped onto solid ground, and reached into my back pocket. Without a word, I pulled out the HOA handbook and flipped to Bylaw 7.3, the one Karen had probably never imagined would be used against her. "Actually, Karen," I said smoothly, handing her a copy of my application, complete with the date stamp showing it had been submitted over 2 weeks ago, "the HOA handbook states that if a request is not denied within 14 days, it's automatically approved. You failed to process it in time, so now it's a greenlight project." Her fingers tightened around the pages as her eyes scanned the document. I could practically hear her teeth grinding. "This is preposterous. I never saw this request," she hissed, her voice dangerously close to a full-blown tantrum. I smiled. "That's not my problem. I have a certified mail receipt proving it was delivered to the HOA office and signed for by you." For the first time, she had no comeback. Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape, a loophole, anything to regain control. But there was none. I had played her game, and won. She took a deep breath, forced her plastic smile back onto her face, and adjusted her sunglasses. "Fine," she said, voice clipped. "But this isn't over." Then she stormed back to her SUV, slammed the door, and peeled away from my driveway, tires screeching as she disappeared down the street. It was the first time I had ever seen her lose. For the next few days, I worked steadily, carefully constructing a 6-foot cinder block wall, smoothing out every detail to perfection. Some of my neighbors even stopped by, offering quiet words of encouragement. Then, on the 5th night of construction, something strange happened. I woke up to a notification on my phone. My security camera had detected movement in my front yard. Frowning, I opened the app and replayed the footage. At 3:42 a.m., a dark-colored SUV slowed down in front of my house. Someone, a shadowy figure in a hooded sweatshirt stepped out, approached my half-finished wall, and pulled something from their pocket. A few moments later, they got back into the SUV and sped off. I threw on a jacket and hurried outside. My stomach dropped as soon as I saw it. Spray-painted in massive black letters across my brand-new cinder blocks were the words asterisk. Eyesore. Trash. Destroy this. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, fists clenched. Karen. It had to be Karen. The next morning, I wasn't surprised when a local news crew pulled up in front of my house, Karen leading the way, her expression a perfect mask of performative outrage. She turned to the camera, shaking her head. This is exactly what happens when people don't respect community guidelines, she said, gesturing to the vandalism on my wall. This is why we have rules in place. This wall is bringing down property values, and now, look, criminal activity. It's a disgrace, The audacity of it stole my breath. She was trying to use the vandalism she orchestrated to justify tearing down my wall. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I was raging. Fine, Karen. You want a war? You just escalated it, That afternoon, I downloaded the security footage and enhanced the image as much as I could. The resolution wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to show that the SUV in the footage had the same make, model, and roof rack Karen's car had. I wasn't just going to finish my wall. I was going to end her reign. I knew Karen wasn't done with me. The graffiti incident had backfired spectacularly. Rather than turning the neighborhood against me, it had only made people more suspicious of the HOA's heavy-handedness. But Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was going to come at me harder, and I wasn't wrong. 2 days after the vandalism, I received an email from my employer's HR department. The subject line alone made my stomach drop: formal inquiry into ethical conduct. Inside was a vague but serious accusation. An anonymous source had reported me for potential conflicts of interest and unlicensed work in violation of county building codes. The email stated that, due to the complaint, my recent projects would be reviewed, and I needed to provide proof of compliance to avoid possible disciplinary action. I sat back, stunned, then furious. Karen. It had to be Karen. She had dug into my professional life, hoping to discredit me or get me fired. The sheer pettiness of it made my skin crawl. My wall was completely legal, built with all necessary permits, and up to every standard imaginable. But Karen wasn't interested in the truth, she was interested in winning. I immediately responded to HR, attaching every permit, every stamped approval, every bit of documentation proving my work was above board. Less than 24 hours later, my boss called me. "We looked into this, Ethan," he said, his voice edged with frustration. "The complaint was baseless. Whoever sent it clearly had a personal grudge. Frankly, I don't appreciate my team's time being wasted on nonsense." He paused. "Off the record, do you have an enemy in your neighborhood?" I nearly laughed. "Yeah. One or two. Well, whoever it is, they failed. You're in the clear." I hung up and stared at the wall of my office, fuming. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president, she was dangerous. She had no problem weaponizing bureaucracy to destroy someone's livelihood. And if she was willing to go this far to ruin me over a wall, what had she done to other homeowners? It was time to find out. That night, I started digging into the HOA's finances. By law, homeowners had the right to review the HOA's financial records. But Karen had made them as inaccessible as possible. Meeting minutes were missing or incomplete. Budget reports were conveniently vague. Then, a breakthrough. I reached out to Mrs. Collins, a retired accountant who had served as HOA treasurer before Karen orchestrated her removal. When I knocked on her door, she welcomed me inside with a knowing smile. "I was wondering when someone would start asking questions," she said, pouring me a cup of tea. For the next hour, she laid it all out. Maintenance costs suddenly doubled after Karen hired her brother-in-law's company. I asked for invoices, and I was told they were confidential. She handed me a stack of old budget sheets, pointing to a massive spike in landscaping expenses. "And this," she continued, tapping another document. "A $30,000 expense labeled Community Beautification Project, but there's no record of what it was actually spent on. And the funniest thing?" She chuckled bitterly. "That's around the same time Karen renovated her backyard." I stared at the papers, heart pounding. She had been stealing from the HOA. Using neighborhood funds to line her own pockets. And no one had caught her, until now. I spent the next week compiling everything. Scans, copies, timelines, testimonies from other former board members. I compared actual market rates for the services Karen's preferred vendors were charging and found they were inflated by nearly double. It was a textbook case of financial misconduct. Karen had spent years fining people for minor infractions, all while draining the HOA's budget for personal gain. And I was about to make sure every single homeowner in Sunnyside Estates knew it. The annual HOA meeting was usually an empty, lifeless affair. Last year, only a dozen homeowners had shown up, most of them Karen's friends. But this time, the community center was packed wall to wall. Word had spread, and as I looked around, I saw nearly 100 residents, each holding a sealed envelope containing the evidence I had compiled. Karen walked in 15 minutes late, her usual air of superiority cracking at the edges as she took in the whispers and tense energy in the room. Her eyes landed on me, narrowing as she saw the packets in everyone's hands. She adjusted her blazer, forced on her signature plastic smile, and called the meeting to order. She didn't even make it past the first agenda item before Mrs. Collins stood up, voice strong and unwavering. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in President Wilkins," she announced. "Based on the financial misconduct, abuse of power, and selective enforcement of HOA rules outlined in these documents, I believe she is unfit to continue leading this community." Karen blanched. This is out of order," she stammered. But it wasn't. Article 4, Section 9 of the HOA bylaws allowed for an immediate recall vote if at least 10% of homeowners present supported it. Nearly a dozen hands shot up to second the motion. What followed was a catastrophic downfall unlike anything I could have imagined. Small Blue Diamond 92 out of 97 homeowners voted to remove Karen as HOA president on the spot. Small Blue Diamond, the HOA's lawyer, who Karen had brought to intimidate me, instead confirmed that the financial irregularities warranted a full audit. Small Blue Diamond Karen's signature was tied to every suspicious expense, from overpriced landscaping fees to a $20,000 emergency repair fund transferred to her personal account. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse for her, two men in suits and county badges entered the room. Karen's face drained of color. "Karen Wilkins," one of them said, "we need to have a word with you regarding multiple ongoing investigations into HOA fund misappropriation and fraud." A hush fell over the crowd as Karen stumbled back, her hands shaking. "Why, you can't be serious," she stammered. The lead investigator flipped open a file. "We have bank records, contractor statements, and multiple complaints dating back 3 years. We'd like you to come with us for questioning." Karen tried to protest, but the murmurs in the room had turned into low, bitter laughter. And then, in front of the entire community she had terrorized for years, Karen Wilkins was escorted out of the building. The HOA board was dissolved. A new president, one who actually cared about the community, was sworn in, and within weeks, major policy changes were made to prevent another Karen-style dictatorship. As I walked home that night, I looked at my perfectly legal 6-foot wall standing tall in the moonlight. I had one. Not just for myself, but for everyone who had suffered under Karen's rule. And as I reached my front door, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. I turned to see Karen, her pristine bob now slightly disheveled, her face twisted in pure rage. You engineered this whole thing," she hissed. "You set me up." I sighed, exhausted. "No, Karen," I said, voice calm. "You did this to yourself. I just followed the rules. Your rules. Every single one of them." She stood there, seething, but before she could launch into another empty threat, Mrs. Collins and the new HOA president stepped out from the community center, waving a fresh audit report. "Would you care to explain why $20,000 of HOA funds were transferred to your personal account?" Mrs. Collins asked, raising an eyebrow. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. And that was the last time anyone in Sunnyside Estates saw Karen Wilkins in a position of power. So tell me, have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare? What's the worst thing they've ever done to you? Share your experience below, let's see who had it worse.